Okay, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today for our presentation titled Registration, Renewal, and Resources, What Every New Social Worker Needs to Know. So this presentation is targeted to new registrants who registered with the college in 2021 and is designed to address many of the common inquiries that we receive. My name is Adrienne Foley. I'm the Coordinator of Communication and Administration with the NLCSW, and I'm joined by Annette Johns, who is the NLCSW Associate Director of Policy and Practice.
Good morning, everyone.
Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. We did mute participants upon entry just for improved audio quality, but any questions throughout the presentation can be inputted via the chat feature, and we will check periodically throughout the presentation. So in terms of our agenda for today, we will explain who we are. We'll look at registration and its connection to the Social Workers Act. We'll delve into the diversity that's within the social work profession in Newfoundland and Labrador. We'll also talk about the continuing professional education policy, as well as annual renewal. And finally, we'll cover the practice resources that are available in the Social Work Toolkit. In terms of who we are, to answer that question, NLCSW is established by legislation to regulate and advance the practice of social work in Newfoundland and Labrador. We do have a new strategic plan for 2021-2024, and that'll be rolled out over the fall. So there will be communication over the course of the year as well, which will delve into the objectives and the actions that will happen on the ground that will help to bring the plan to life. So the vision, the mission, and the values that you see on the screen, they will remain consistent as we move into our new plan. However, a key part of the plan will be clearly defining the values, as these are overarching and they inform all aspects of NLCSW's work. As I noted in the previous slide, NLCSW is established by legislation to regulate and advance the practice of social work in Newfoundland and Labrador. The Social Workers Act is the provincial legislation which regulates social work practice in the province. So what does that really mean? It means that you must be registered with NLCSW to use the title social worker or to practice within the scope of the social work profession as defined in the Social Workers Act. And registration with NLCSW grants the registered social worker designation. So as part of registering with NLCSW, you would have received a certificate of registration in the mail. We do encourage all registrants to proudly display the certificate. The certificate assures the public that you have the specialized knowledge and skills to practice social work in the province. And another benefit of registration with NLCSW is the automatic affiliation with the Canadian Association of Social Workers. The CASW is comprised of 9 provincial and territorial partner organizations, including us, the NLCSW. So we've now reached the point in our presentation where we have our first polling question. So we do encourage all attendees to participate in the polling questions. So our first polling question is, how many registered social workers are in Newfoundland and Labrador? And the options are 1,000, 1,350, or 1,700. I'll just give everyone a moment to respond. And it looks like the majority did answer correctly. The social work profession in Newfoundland and Labrador is actually one of the largest health professions in the province, with 1,700 RSWs. It is a very diverse profession, with social workers practicing in a wide variety of practice areas, including hospitals, seniors' homes, adult and youth corrections, child welfare, addictions, mental health, and the list goes on. What you see on your screen now, we just wanted to bring this to your attention. It is a common inquiry that we often receive, particularly from new registrants. And it basically centers around the fact that they're working but not in a social work position. So this statement reflects a common misconception that a position actually needs to be titled social worker to be considered employed in social work. So what we always encourage people to consider is the question, are you using your social work knowledge, skills, and abilities in the position? If the answer is yes, then you are considered employed in social work. And therefore, registration with NLCSW would need to be maintained. And for those that don't maintain registration, there are re-entry to practice provisions in place to ensure competency to practice. These provisions require the completion of the Association of Social Work Boards exam as a condition of registration, and that's applicable to applicants who have been previously registered as a social worker, but let their registration lapse for 3 years or more. And it's also required for applicants who graduate from an accredited social work program more than 3 years ago and have never been registered. So before we move into the continuing professional education component of the presentation, I'll just check the chat feature.
I have to go when we're talking.
Sorry, it doesn't seem to be coming up there. We will certainly see if we can rectify that, that issue, but regardless, we will check it at the end of the presentation. NLCSW has had a policy on the submission of continuing professional education credits since the mid-1990s. And this is actually consistent with all regulated professions, as they all have the commitment to lifelong learning, remaining current, and offering the highest quality of professional service. So CPE is actually embedded into the CASW Code of Ethics, as well as the NLCSW Standards of Practice. And Annette will actually review these documents as part of the Social Work Toolkit, which is presented later in the presentation. So CPE really needs to be a core part of your commitment to the individuals, the families, the groups, and the communities that you serve, whether that be in direct practice, policy, management, or research. So in terms of the policy itself, I'll just review basically like the nuts and bolts of the policy. It is overseen by the NLCSW Registration Committee, and the policy is reviewed annually to make sure it continues to meet the needs and reflects social work practice in the province. The full policy is accessible under the CE menu on our website. So that's www.nlcsw.ca. The actual policy itself is divided into two main categories. You have your required and your elective credits. And I'm actually going to explore those further as part of the next slide. So in terms of the annual requirement, you need a minimum of 40 Cpe credits in total, and at least 20 of those must come from the required category. And in terms of how it breaks down, so 1 credit is equal to 1 hour of learning. And the registration committee that, like I mentioned, oversees the policy, they annually conduct a CPE audit each year as part of annual renewal. It's a random audit, and so social workers are randomly selected to participate, and you're notified by email at the time of registration renewal. And if you're audited, you would need to submit additional CPE details, such as the completion date of events, the event title, and the description. If you're not selected for an audit, then you're only submitting the hours that you accumulate over the course of the registration year. And this is submitted directly through the online renewal application through my nlcsw.ca. So for example, as part of 2022 renewal, you will be submitting credits that you accumulate during the 2021 registration year. So we'll just dive a bit into the differences between required and elective credits. Required credits are really related to the practice of social work. So they're more transferable skills. And if you look in the actual CPE policy, you'll see definitions for what fits under required, such as workshops, conferences, and courses. The electives, on the other hand, they tend to be more informal, so they're more targeted to your position. So an example will be self-directed learning. So if you're reading articles related to social work practice, or a category that's called in-service training, and that's training that's really related to your job. So we often tell registrants that if you're trying to determine, the distinction between required and elective credits, it's important to consider two things primarily. One, if it's enhancing your social work skills, and two, if it's transferable across the profession. So if the answer to both is yes, then it would tend to fall under required. And just to let you know, all CPE that's offered by the college does fall under the required category of workshops. So we'll just consider some examples in terms of helping to clarify that distinction between required and elective. One example would be mental health first aid training. That would be considered required, while CPR and just standard first aid will be considered elective. Another example would be training a new legislation. That would be considered required, while training for a new computer program at work, that would be something that would be considered elective. So as you can see, based on these examples, the CPE policy is really designed to cover a broad range of activities and to provide members with flexibility in meeting the annual CPE requirement. So as the policy is expansive, there can be a degree of professional judgment involved when determining if and where an event fits under the policy. Now, that being said, given the high number of social workers that we do have employed with the Department of CSSD, the registration committee has accredited a number of their training modules, and that's actually broken down on our website under the CE menu. So still related to CPE, I just wanted to highlight some additional information that's on our website, again, under the CE menu. You'll find sources of CPE. That includes our events calendar. So that includes not only events that are being offered by NLCSW, but also other organizations. We also have archived webinars that are available for viewing through our YouTube channel, and you can actually claim these as required credits upon viewing under the workshop category. And under that same page on our website, you'll also find a link to other sources of CPE. So I know, for example, we have the Association of Social Work Boards listed there. We have Crisis Trauma and Resource Institute, and there's lots of other examples. In terms of CPE funding, there are two primary sources. So we have the NLCSW Professional Development Fund, and that provides up to $200 for current NLCSW members to attend CPE events that comply with the policy. And the draws take place twice a year in March and September. And then the Casw Bms Scholarship, that offers scholarships to assist social workers as well to attend educational events. And depending on the pool of applicants that we receive, it's either one scholarship valued at $1,500 or two scholarships valued at $750 each. And that's awarded in September of each year. So the full eligibility criteria and the application forms, they're all available on our website. So we've now reached the second polling question, and it is obviously focused on CPE. Okay, here we go. So the second polling question, you completed your BSW in 2021. Can courses completed as part of the BSW degree be claimed as CPE credits? I'll just give a moment to answer. Okay, so it looks like the majority are saying yes. In fact, the correct answer is no. Courses completed as part of the BSW degree cannot be claimed as CPE, as completion of the degree is required as the baseline for registration. So before we move into the annual renewal process, I did want to highlight this valuable feature that's available through mynlcsw.ca, and it's the Update My CPE tracker. So registrants can use this feature throughout the registration year to track their completed CPE. And as detailed on the screen, you just log into mynlcsw.ca, you click on Update My CPE, and then you can record the CPE details, including the date, the title, the category, and the number of credit hours. And this does really help to streamline annual renewal because there's a button that's part of the CPE step of the online renewal process where you can transfer over what you've recorded under this feature. So I'm just going to check the chat feature for a moment, but it doesn't seem like we have any questions right now, so we'll continue on. So now we'll get into the annual renewal process. And this obviously would be new to everyone that's attending our session today as new registrants. What will happen is that you will be notified by email in mid-January when online renewal is open. So obviously it's important to keep your email up to date with NLCSW because that's the primary way that we communicate with members. So once you receive that email, you can actually then go ahead and log into mynlcsw.ca using your 4-digit registration number and password. Now, I know the passwords that you would have received are computer generated, so they might be a bit difficult to remember, but the online system does provide the option to specify your own password. So I do encourage people to go in before the busy renewal season and avail of that process. And basically on the login screen, you click Forgot My Password, and then it'll take you through the steps to actually specify your own unique individual password. So the main difference that you're going to see between the initial application that you would have recently completed and renewal would be the submission of Cpe credits. So there will be a Cpe step that's part of the online renewal application where you would input your Cpe credit details. And as I just mentioned, you can help to streamline that process by using the Update My Cpe feature throughout the registration year. And in terms of the renewal deadline, it's February 15th. Midnight Island time, and any renewals that are received after this deadline are charged a late fee. So I'm just going to pass things over to my colleague Annette Johns, and she's going to delve into the social work toolkit.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrienne. So the NLCSW is committed to the development of practice resources to provide support and guidance to social workers in practice. And we believe that ongoing communication about this is very important. So every month we send out an electronic update to members by email, outlining things that are happening at NLCSW, any education events that are being planned, and registration details around that. And of course, we update members through the update around any new practice resources that have been developed. So today we just want to give you an overview of what some of the practice resources that are available to you as registered social workers here in the province. And I'm very fortunate is that this is a large part of my role is working with members to develop these practice resources. So in order to kind of look at all the practice resources that we do have, we put together what we call a social work toolkit. And I really, say it's our regulatory toolkit because it provides important information that social workers need to be aware of in their practice. So as you can see on your screen, the toolkit is comprised of standards of practice, which, really outline the practice requirements that must be adhered to by social workers in the province. And these are always informed by the Canadian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Ethical Practice. So we have our standards of practice for Newfoundland and Labrador that were recently updated in 2020. So those are standards that you will be familiar with in your practice. Then we have explanatory documents, and these are really meant to provide information and direction on the standards of practice. So they look at different elements within the standards, main standards of practice, and kind of delve further into what some of those best practices look like. So we have technology use, cultural competence, recording, supervision, and custody and access. So you'll see on your slide there that the technology use in social work practice was recently updated just last week. That was approved by our board, so it was updated for 2021. That looks at best practices around how do we use technology in our practices in an ethical and safe way. Then we also have our guideline documents that provide information and guidance on issues related to social work practice and really affirms what our professional responsibilities are. And again, we have lots of documents there, as you can see on your screen, in terms of, diagnosis using DSM-5, enduring power of attorney, informed consent, medical assistance in dying, decision-specific capacity assessments, and so forth. So those are great documents that you can certainly avail of through our website. And then we have our interpretive documents that really provides information, clarification, and commentary on professional and ethical issues. So we have an ethical decision-making resource guide, some self-assessment tools for informed consent and documentation. We have a whole practice matters, ethical compass, and documentation matters series. And I'm going to go through some examples of some of these resources throughout the next little while. But I'm quite proud of what we do produce here at NLCSW in terms of providing that support and guidance to social workers. And I do want to preface it by saying that many times these resources are developed based on inquiries that we're getting from members. So that could be from a phone call that we get from a member asking about a standard or an ethics consultation. So we really try to be responsive to what the needs of social workers are in the current context of practice. So I just want to say that piece. So we do have another polling question. So in addition to the CASW Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Ethical Practice, social workers must be familiar and adhere to the standards of practice. And we're just going to pull up that polling. Trying to get the, I think you got to click up there. Yep. In that one. So is that yes, no, or unsure that social workers must be familiar with and adhere to the NLCSW standards of practice? Probably gave that one away. And I'm seeing yes. And you're absolutely right. So if you look at, if you look at the next slide, and this diagram is included in our standards of practice. So it really is the regulatory framework for social work in Newfoundland and Labrador. So in addition to the Social Workers Act, the CASW Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Ethical Practice, social workers also have to be familiar with and adhere to the standards of practice. And I'm going to go through the standards, just kind of introduce you to what that document looks like. And then, of course, as I said earlier, we do have those explanatory documents and practice guidelines that are grounded in the standards, are grounded in the Code of Ethics, and just provide additional clarification and practice guidance. So here is the table of contents from the standards of practice. And again, these go through many different standards. So there's 24 in total, and I'm going to go through a couple in just a few minutes. But as you can see from the table of contents, the standards do address issues pertaining to registration, competence, informed consent, documentation, interjurisdictional practice, dual and multiple relationships, culture and diversity, and the list goes on. So, it's really important to, if you haven't done so already, to take those standards of practice and to really look at what the standards are pertaining to each of these areas. And then if you do have questions, you can certainly always call our office and have a conversation with myself or one of the other social work staff here. So here's an example of one component, one standard that's included in the standards of practice, and it pertains to social media. And so we get a lot of, consults pertaining to social media. So it's no wonder it's included in our standards of practice and across, standards of practice across jurisdictions of other social work organizations as well. And some of the ethical dilemmas that social workers face pertaining to social media, a client may connect with a social worker through Facebook or send a friend request or want to connect on another social media platform, or times when a social worker may consider searching Facebook for client information, for example. So in addition to the Code of Ethics, and social workers can now review the standards to inform and enrich their decision making. And as I noted a few minutes ago, we just revised the explanatory document on technology use in social work practice. And that document is intended to support social workers in using technology, highlight awareness of some of the practice standards, considerations, and ethical responsibilities when using technology in practice, and inform social workers, employees, and the public on best practices for technology use in social work practice. So in addition to the standards, those explanatory documents really help enrich and provide more context to some of the standards as well. And then we also have other great information related to different elements from the standards of practice. So we have many resources pertaining to social media, e-professionalism, electronic social work practice, and so forth. And I'll go through some of those a little bit later in the presentation. This is another standard that comes from our standards of practice. And informed consent really is integral to the social worker-client relationship. And I always say that good informed consent can often mitigate some of the ethical challenges that we face as social workers in our careers. So the standard speaks to the importance of seeking informed consent of clients prior to the delivery of social work services and throughout the professional relationship as necessary. Documenting informed consent, evaluating client capacity to give informed consent, addressing issues pertaining to, confidentiality, limits to confidentiality, and providing clients with information on, the intervention itself, risks and benefits, how long the intervention will take, how termination will be handled, and so forth. And the whole philosophy and principle behind informed consent is to promote the self-determination and autonomy of clients. And, in terms of dignity and respect and privacy, all those pieces that make up good informed consent. And as well as the standards that outline those practice requirements, we do have other resources that social workers can avail of, one being the self-assessment tool for informed consent and documentation that was developed by our NLCSW Ethics Committee. So there's lots of resources, and many of our resources interconnect with one another. So you might read one practice document and it might address informed consent, but the title may not be informed consent, but there's always every practice document that we produce relate back to the standards of practice. So now I have another polling question. Get your thoughts around interjurisdictional practice. In your opinion, can registered social workers in Newfoundland and Labrador practice in other Canadian provinces with their NLCSW registration? Just give you a moment to answer that. Okay, we have the majority who said no. There was some unsure there as well. But this is something, particularly since COVID, that we've received many questions pertaining to interjurisdictional practice, and importantly, our standards of practice do address this. So registration with the NLCSW is required to practice social work in Newfoundland and Labrador. And each jurisdiction outside of the province have their own regulatory requirements pertaining to the delivery of social work services in their jurisdiction. So as outlined in the standards of practice, social workers who provide social work services across jurisdictions must comply with the regulatory and registration requirements within that particular jurisdiction where the client is located or residing. And that will be necessary if it's face-to-face or electronic. So if you're a social worker here in Newfoundland and Labrador, you're providing electronic social work services to a client living in another jurisdiction, you would need to connect with their social work regulatory body in that jurisdiction to inquire about what registration or regulatory requirements must be met. As outlined in the standards of practice, it is also recommended that social workers who engage in interjurisdictional practice have the appropriate professional liability insurance. And e-service delivery is covered by the Canadian Association of Social Workers Professional Liability Insurance Program. So that's a great resource to tap into in terms of getting your professional liability insurance. And social workers also have to comply with legislation and reporting requirements in those other jurisdictions. So, for example, child protection concerns or adult protection concerns and those kinds of things. So you have to be familiar with those legislations as well. So because we get so many questions pertaining to interjurisdictional practice, we did develop a frequently asked questions guideline document that addresses many of the questions that we have received. So we've, had questions around, I have a client who's a rotational worker and they're going to be living in another jurisdiction or working in another jurisdiction for a few weeks. Can I still provide services? So all those kinds of questions are answered in that particular document, and that can be found on the NLCSW website under practice documents. Okay, so I did highlight the technology piece, but we have many other explanatory documents, as you noted from our toolkit that we presented first. So let's say you're in a practice scenario and you're working with clients from diverse cultural backgrounds. What NLCSW resource can you access to help guide your practice? And that would be the Cultural Competence in Social Work Practice Explanatory Document that was approved by our board back in May of 2016. And the adoption of this document was really exciting for us because we were the first jurisdiction in Canada to have standards on cultural competence. And this document really outlines best practices in working with diverse cultures, raising awareness of some of the ethical considerations, promoting continuing education in this area, and encourages dialogue and reflection. And there are 8 best practice standards included in that document. So this is a really great document to review, regardless of your area of practice, to kind of look at what some of the best practices are around fostering cultural competence in social work practice. And we really see competence not as an endpoint, but as a continued journey of reflection, of continuing education, in terms of those best practices around working in culturally diverse areas. And we can't have a presentation without speaking about social work ethics. So as you know, ethical decision-making is a core component of professional social work practice. And every day, certainly social workers across the province are dealing with ethical dilemmas in their practice. And some of the calls and questions that we've received as part of our ethical consultation process, I just put a few up there on the screen in terms of, should social workers disclose personal information about themselves to clients? Should social workers ever hug a client? Should social workers accept clients as friends on Facebook or other social media platforms? How should social workers respond when a client offers them a gift or a complimentary service or product, for example? And we know that in resolving these dilemmas, many people, many social workers consult with their peers or consult with a manager and supervisor. And we also get those calls here. So I am the staff lead for the ethics consultations. If I'm not here, another social work staff member can provide that consultation. But as we know, when it comes to ethics, the resolution of dilemmas in practice are never straightforward. There's always so many different pieces to look at. So it is always helpful to take a step back and tease out what the ethical issues and considerations are. And this is why the NLCSW Ethics Committee took the initiative to develop an ethical decision-making tool that social workers could use in their practice in working through ethical dilemmas. And I'm just going to go through that tool very briefly and just kind of highlight what the tool addresses. So this guide is grounded in the Code of Ethics and professional literature, and is a resource that social workers can use to navigate ethical complexities in practice, but also in terms of making good ethical decisions. It does capture best practices and presents an ethics-informed decision-making model, yet it's succinct and user-friendly. It's about 7 pages in length. So if you were to go to the website and looking up literature, you'll find reams of information regarding ethical decision-making models. What our ethics committee did was to kind of take all that information, take the best practices, and provide a model that we could use, that social workers could use here in their practice. So in this guide, you'll find reference to the Code of Ethics and the guidelines for ethical practice and the standards of practice. We'll look at, we do highlight the components of ethical decision-making, looking at ethical theory and professional ethical orientation. There's a piece around reflection around one's own risk tolerance, professional and personal risk tolerance, the importance of critical thinking and professional judgment. And then there is an ethical decision-making model that's presented in that. And I'll just kind of share that with you in the next slide. So it does comprise of 17 steps. You may not need to go through each, step each time you're in an ethical dilemma, but it certainly is a checklist to kind of go through. Have you thought about these particular questions, and are they applicable to the dilemma that you're facing? So, for example, the first step is to actually articulate what is the ethical dilemma. Is it a conflict between two values? Is there a conflict between one's personal values and professional values, for example? What theoretical lens are you using? What pieces from the Code of Ethics, standards of practice, and ethical guidelines apply to the situation? And are those documents providing guidance around some of that? Is there agency policy, legal considerations, cultural considerations? There's a question in there around, was it addressed through the informed consent process? So often going back through and thinking, okay, did I cover this through informed consent, for example? And also around looking at the impact on the therapeutic relationship. Are some questions just to get you thinking as you're thinking about those dilemmas. And of course, the importance of documenting the ethical decision-making process. So this is a really great model that kind of takes, as I said earlier, the literature and other models, kind of pulls out what some of the best practices are that you can kind of just have on your desk. And if you're faced with an ethical dilemma, to go down through some of those questions can certainly help you as you navigate those complexities in practice. So another polling question, we want to have you engaged as much as we can. Technology is great, but I mean, it doesn't replace face-to-face. So we do try to add the engagement things where we can. So this question is, you have a youth, you're working with a youth who is 15 years. Can they provide consent to counseling? Just give you another moment there. Okay, I'm seeing yes and unsure. Yeah. Thank you for filling out. That's all right. So we do, as I noted earlier, produce a lot of documents pertaining to informed consent. So in 2019, the NLCSW developed a resource document for social workers titled Informed Consent with Children and Youth Practice Guidelines for Social Work. And again, I just put a picture of the table of contents in there because it's hard to go through the whole document. But this document does highlight some of the things that social workers should consider when they work with children and youth as it relates to informed consent. So often it's not a clear, straightforward answer. Because you do have to look at it from, the different issues pertaining, for example, to age of majority, the mature minor doctrine. What factors do we need to consider in the assessment of mature minor? Ethical decision-making and practice considerations, documentation, and knowledge of what relevant legislation pertains to each particular issue. So you might have, a 15-year-old who has, great decision-making, has capacity to make decisions, where another 15-year-old, you might have, concerns about their capacity to make decisions, for example. So it's always that process of checking, around some of these factors. And this guideline document was developed to help kind of situate some of that in terms of what factors do I need to consider around the assessment of capacity, but, in terms of determining informed consent with children and youth. So I encourage you to read those documents, because unless we're doing a specific education on a particular tool or resource, it's hard to delve into it. So certainly we encourage you to read all these documents where you can, and you can claim that as CPE under elective, as Adrian would have went through those categories for self-directed learning. So anything you read, any publications through NLCSW that you're reading and reflecting on would count as continuing professional education credits. So this is a great resource that we actually launched back in 2011. So it's 10 years old now. It's hard to believe, but it was created as an educational tool to highlight and address ethical issues in practice. And these practice documents are usually based upon ethical questions or consultations that we have with members, or on emerging ethical trends in social work practice. They tend to be about 5 to 7 pages in length, and social work staff here at the office rotate writing these particular publications. To date, we've produced 22 practice matters documents, and the topics have included electronic social work practice, accountability in professional practice, termination of social worker-client relationships, informed consent, conflicts of interest, self-disclosure, e-professionalism. One of the first ones we produced was around social media use. So even 10 years ago, that was a topic that social workers were seeking consultation on around social media use. And as I explained earlier in the presentation, it is embedded in our standards of practice, and we have many resources around that particular one. So yes, those are on our website as well. So you can just go in and read those. They're listed by topic and year. So you can just go in and peruse those as you're able to. So this is a snapshot from the latest edition of Practice Matters that was produced, and that one focused on the importance of knowing your code of ethics and standards of practice. So I just want to give you a little flavor there of how it looks. So this particular one talks about, when you're dealing with issues, practice issues, or ethical issues in practice, it's important to always ground that in the code of ethics and standards of practice. So actually knowing what those documents are, because we all espouse as social workers to a code of ethics and values, but knowing the nitty-gritty and really getting into, okay, what is the code saying, what are the guidelines, and what are the standards? I often get consults and people haven't reviewed those documents prior to calling, and we just work down through that. And it does provide, an ethical framework for making decisions. So that Practice Matters really focused in on that. And there's some case scenarios in there that bring that to life. And in all of our Practice Matters, generally we have case examples or case scenarios that kind of speak to the issue that's being addressed. Then we have our Ethical Compass series, and this was a project that was initiated by the NLCSW Ethics Committee back in 2018. And to date, we've had 13 publications of Ethical Compass, with a new one coming out this month. And similar to Practice Matters, each Ethical Compass focuses on an ethical issue or topic, and is really meant to provide some further guidance in terms of the code and standards. The latest one that was produced in May did focus on virtual care. And as we know, that's certainly something that we're seeing an increase in terms of technology use to deliver social work services. And the one that we have coming out at the end of this month is going to be focused on boundaries in practice. Others have explored topics related to dual and multiple relationships, countertransference, cultural competence, and the disclosure of client information, to name a few. these publications tend to be much shorter, than Practice Matters. They're about 2 pages in length. And they are a great resource for social workers in practice. And again, the topics are generated by the Ethics Committee based on ethical consultations, practice consults, and trends in practice. We have a lot of practice resources to get through, but we're almost at the end. Documentation Matters is also an initiative of the NLCSW Ethics Committee, and I'm the staff lead on that committee, and love our discussions every month around ethics and social work practice. And so Documentation Matters is an initiative that we launched in 2019, and there have been 8 publications to date. And Documentation Matters highlights issues related to social work documentation in a concise format. So they tend to be about half page in length, and the material is laid out in bullet form. So it's quick, it's succinct, and it just highlights the main points. It'll highlight what the issue is, the standards, and any applicable guidelines that need to be considered. So this was our latest one that just came out in September that looked at documentation and interdisciplinary teams. Other topics have explored questions such as, how do I know if I'm recording too much or too little? How should social workers respond when a client says, don't record that in my file? And things that social workers need to consider in terms of documenting informed consent. And like the ethical compass, the topics that we cover in Documentation Matters are generated through consultation, ethical consultations, committee discussion, and practice trends. So here's a snapshot, a screenshot from our website. So you have the toolkit, you know what's in our toolkit, but where do you find it? So currently on the NLCSW website, you'll go into the main page, and you'll come across at the top, there's registration, social work in-and-out, continuing education, practice resources, regulation. If you click on practice resources, you'll get a drop-down menu that includes, links to the Code of Ethics and Standards, Ethical Compass, Practice Standards, Practice Documents, Practice Matters, Documentation Matters, and our Connecting Voices publication, which is our provincial newsletter that's published twice a year. You'll find those there as well, and other resources and links. So you just drop down there, everything you need to know with regards to our practice resources will be underneath that particular drop-down menu. And that's it from our practice resources. Again, I only gave you kind of just some of the treetops around what some of those practice resources are. We're always developing new resources and new publications. So if you do have any thoughts and comments around some of that, we certainly would love to hear from you. And if you have any questions today, feel free to put those in the chat box as well.
Yeah. And I'll just check the chat again before we move on. Okay, so this is the last of our polling questions, and just to say thanks to Annette for that great summary of NLCSW's practice resources. Before I launch this poll, I just want to give some context. NLCSW, we have always used email as our primary communication tool with registrants, so you would be receiving our monthly update, which contains all the essential information regarding social work practice in Newfoundland. And as I previously mentioned, you'll get your renewal notices and anything related to registration renewal would be issued by email. We also have a Twitter presence. So we have almost 400 followers, and we do tweet a wide range of information on a regular basis. But what we're doing now, we're currently exploring other social media platforms, and we'd like to get your feedback in that regard. Obviously, the addition of another social media platform is a big decision, and we would have to take a number of factors into consideration. But gathering registrant feedback is a really important step in the process. So that's what this polling question focuses on. So this polling question asks, through which social media platform or platforms would you prefer to receive communication from NLCSW?
And it is multiple choice, so you can pick more than one.
Yeah. Okay, so it looks like we have about half and half between Twitter and Facebook. So that's really helpful and good to know. Okay. Thanks for responding to that. We appreciate your feedback. So we have now reached the end of our presentation and just wanted to, summarize a few key points in terms of the importance of staying connected and staying involved with NLCSW. So as I've noted a couple times throughout the presentation, we will continue regular communication by email. So it's important to keep your email up to date. And really any contact information, if there's changes throughout the registration year, you can log into mynlcsw.ca and update that information. We would also encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at NLCSWCA. And like I just mentioned, we do tweet regularly. So it'd be nice to get some more followers. Now, I'm not sure if there's any questions at this point regarding anything that we've covered. I'll check the chat feature. I'll give everyone a moment or so just in case you do want to type anything in there. And I mean, everyone is always welcome to follow up directly with the office as well. Our contact information is available on our website. Okay, and just a few comments there, just thanking us for the session, and we were really grateful for everyone who signed up and the opportunity really to share this information, especially with new registrants who are new to NLCSW, and we wish you much success in your social work careers.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's always great to connect and to share what's available, and to go through some of those questions that people do have. But I do encourage you to read some of the resources, to look at the standards and the code, but also to let us know if there's topics and questions that you would like to see addressed in a practice resource, something I can bring back to the ethics committee. We're always wanting, member feedback on those kinds of things, and that's always greatly appreciated. And feel free to share that information and what you learned in terms of practice resources with colleagues, because we do put quite an emphasis on developing resources for our members, and hopefully members have find that to be very valuable in terms of because if one member has an issue or a topic or an ethical dilemma, chances are that's going to translate to other social workers who are thinking about the same topic or the same issue.
Mm-hmm.
So the resources are very helpful in terms of providing context around some of those issues. And to Reconnecting Voices as well, because that's a great publication as well. That's written by RSWs from across the province that share and promote their practice and issues that they want to write about in terms of social work practice. So that's another great resource that you have at your fingertips in terms of reading as well. And we have our online publications from that back to 2008. Online editions of Connecting Voices are on the website. All right. Well, I guess we don't see any other questions in the chat. So again, so we did have a question. Someone wondering if we help with, I guess, people seeking employment. No, not as specific. We do get calls from members quite a bit around that. So we do link people with the resources that we're familiar with in terms of the regional health authorities,
Public Service
CSSD, Public Service Commission, and the Community Sector Council as well, in terms of, because obviously social workers are employed in health authorities and at CSSD and in community. So we just kind of point or direct social workers to some of those sources. And we also have an employment section on our website when we receive information from employers that they want to post there as well. So we just kind of point to, social workers to some of those resources that they can, and places where they can follow up around employment opportunities.
Yeah, and the career section on our website is located under the social work in NL menu. So the career section is a sub menu under that main menu.